Come to order. It is Tuesday, February 7th, 2023, and it is 2:05 p.m. Madam Secretary, please read the roll.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chairwoman Rivera,
Here.
Vice Chairman Pierce, Member Betancourt, Member DeSimone,
Present.
Member Johnson,
Present.
Member Scholes, Member West,
Present.
Executive Director Robert Raposa,
Present.
Legal Counsel Raymond Pacha.
Present.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Item number 1 on today's agenda. The board may discuss and vote to approve the minutes of the meeting held on Tuesday, January 10th, 2023. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
Motion to approve the minutes.
Moved by Mr. DeSimone, seconded by Mr. West. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Unanimously approved. Item number 2, the board may discuss and vote to approve to amend the 2023 meeting schedule for the board to change the meeting time to 2:00 p.m. Any discussion on this item? Hearing none, do we have a motion to approve the amendment?
So moved.
Moved by Mrs. Johnson, seconded by Mr. West. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? It's unanimous. Item number 3, the board may discuss and vote to support the legislation to be presented to the General Assembly by the staff of the Board of Elections as set forth in the attached legislative summary. And we will hear from Miguel. Good afternoon, Miguel.
Good afternoon, members of the board. First, I will cover our first proposed piece of legislation out of the 5 pieces of legislation that we'll be discussing today. Each of you should have received a packet. I'm going to stay in that order. In the packet that you have, you should have the nomination papers, objections to nomination papers first in your packets there.
Please note that Mr. Scholes is now present.
So first, I'd like to provide the summary for the proposed legislation for filing objections to nomination papers. This proposal would allow the board to establish rules and regulations for objections to non-papers. It will also allow the Board of Elections 7 days to conduct a hearing rather than the current requirement of 2 days under 1714-4. As you know, in 2022, 8 objections were filed for nomination papers for statewide offices. 5 of these were for the primary, 3 were for the general election. Under 1714-14, the board was required to render a decision within 2 days of this deadline, or July 20th. However, because of the broad nature of the objections and the large volume of signatures required to be reviewed by our staff, it took an additional 5 calendar days for the staff to properly prepare for the hearing. This included time needed to actually obtain the challenge nomination papers from the Secretary of State, which they did a great job getting us scanned copies in advance of the originals. However, it did take them some time, as expected, to scan such a large volume of documents to us, and also receive and review any evidence provided by the objectors, research each signature disqualified by the local board, and prepare the material for presentation to the board in a proper format that could be presented. The objections procedures for the primary candidates was completed on July 26th, but the entire process for all 8 candidates took 5 meetings and almost 4 full weeks. With this legislation, by allowing the board to establish defined rules for objections through the regulatory process, would make the objections process more efficient. And the additional time would allow the staff to better prepare each objection for review by the board under any established rules and regulations. I will note that we have discussed this proposal with the Elections Division of the Secretary of State, and they have indicated some concern about extending this deadline due to the need to prepare ballots for transmittal to military and overseas voters, which must be done by late July. And the staff is aware of their concerns, and we feel that these 7 additional days would still allow the Secretary of State's office to send out those ballots by the deadline. We understand that the window would be smaller. However, given the experience that we underwent in 2022, we do understand that there needs to be some sort of accommodation made to be able to properly process the objections and present them to the board so you can render a decision based on all of the information available. I'm happy to answer any questions about this proposal.
Any questions of Miguel on this particular item? Mr. Scholes?
Just one question, that's, you talked about 17, 14, 14.
Yes.
Put your mic
With
on.
respect, about this deadline, how many days would there be for the Secretary of State to prepare the ballot after the 7 days has expired?
Well, we worked closely with them in the 2022 objections process, and they were waiting patiently for the objections process to be completed so they could print those ballots with enough time to get them to they could get them prepared in enough time to have them prepared by the vendor. So their deadline changes, but they do need, and they are here, so I don't want to speak for them. However, we do know that they do need a few days to actually prepare the ballots and get them to the vendor so they can be sent out to military and overseas by the 45 deadline required under federal law.
Mhm.
Okay, thanks.
Put your mic on. Yes, Mrs. Johnson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Miguel, to that end, and forgive me if I missed this, why the going from 2 to 7 days versus somewhere in between? Was there a specific reason for the 7 versus 5?
Well, the 7 requests the worst case scenario and we believe we undertook the worst case scenario in 2022 with the 8 statewide candidates. I mean, I haven't in 23 years experienced that. I don't believe Bob has either to that volume. It would always be our intention to get those objections done well within the 7 days when we're dealing with state representative or contest, state senate or local contest. But for those large volumes there, we would need the additional time and to be able to review all the material.
Madam Chair, just
Mr.
two
DeSimone, yes.
questions. Well, with respect to the 7 days, I guess the only concern I would have, and that's between our office and the Secretary's office, as to whether or not, I mean, that 7 days could conceivably morph into 11 days if it included 2 weekends. And would that put the Secretary's office in a position where it would affect the ballot? That would be my only concern on the 7 business days, because that's essentially what we're talking about. But the prior paragraph of the statute, where we talk about the local board having to indicate in writing the basis for rejection. And I think that came out of one of our hearings. Is that correct?
It is correct.
The only concern I would have is in this last section, and it's certainly something that could be taken care of either prior to or with the submission of a sub A at some point, is rather than the language that says the state board shall not consider any challenge in the absence of a written basis, maybe some language that suggests that in the absence of a written basis, that signature should be considered as a valid signature, rather than say that, we would not consider the objection. I guess just rather than put it in the negative terms, I prefer it to be in positive language, but that's just basically a language issue that I'd have at some point, but certainly not enough to not support this. But the other thing that I would hope is even if we are going to approve the staff request for submission, that we're at least going to review them at a subcommittee at some point, Madam Chair, because I know we appointed a subcommittee. I think in talking to Mr. Reposa before the meeting, the subcommittee is still a standing subcommittee, Bob, right? Correct. So that at least the subcommittee should review this for any changes that you might want to make as a committee and then report those to the board.
Are you
'Cause-
talking just our staff recommendations or all of the
Well,
recommendations?
I was just going to do the staff now, but the other ones, I'm going to make the same suggestion. I just think with the staff recommendations, we're in a different position because as I understand it, the House requires submissions next week. At least sometime next week, the
That's what I was
16th.
going to ask. What is our timetable here? Because we don't have a lot of time.
Well, the House submission's required on the 16th,
Uh-huh.
but certainly we'd have a couple of months to put a sub-A together if it was needed,
I mean, if warranted, yeah.
right?
I can see that.
But at least have the subcommittee look at these in a little more depth than the way we're looking at them today. But certainly, I think the proposals that the staff's making in these last two, in this first situation with the nomination papers, I mean, I think this comes out of our requests anyway.
Right.
So I don't have an issue with that, but, and I don't have an issue with the board saying that we're gonna let the staff recommendations go forward, but I do think they need to be reviewed at some point by the subcommittee. That's my only suggestion, but, as far as and I'd like to examine that 7-day period a little bit as well, and maybe get some input from the secretary's office on the 7-day period.
And you're saying that you would rather see more positive language as far as?
Well, yeah, I mean, I just think that we could restructure that language a little bit, but again, that somebody at the legislature may want to do that as well. So I'm not saying that that's something we need to do today.
Well, we could make that change now if you'd like to do that.
It'd be difficult to set it out low on the
Okay.
fly.
All right. Any other
And
comments?
I
on
just
this?
would like to expand on Commissioner
Sure.
DeSimone's comments, just to expand on that portion, which he makes a good point. That did come out of previous board meetings during the nomination papers. If you recall, the nomination papers, we had a varying degree of wording on the coding. Voter not found, BNF, wrong district, WD. Some communities wrote it, some did not, some used different terminology. We've been working very closely with the Secretary of State's office, his elections division, and they, based on our discussions, they appear to be in agreement that there's some standards should be set statewide. So the local boards will have a standard coding for each signature rejection. So that way the candidate knows exactly why a signature was rejected. And then we also know here why it was rejected and what exactly we're researching. And they can challenge those signature rejections on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I think that's a critical change that needs to be made because we really did have some issues here with trying to figure out what a check and an X meant and what what the codes were.
Yes.
So,
And presumably, Miguel, is the presumption that we would issue some type of regulation setting forth what the requirements would be,
That
For
is the
each
intent,
board.
yes.
and then it would be uniform
Yes.
for every, okay.
Madam,
yes. Mrs.
Just,
Johnson.
just a comment. I just want to go on record concurring with Commissioner DeSimone. I found the process that we used with the subcommittee really thorough. I know for one, as much information as I can have to process more thoroughly. So I would agree with making sure that these get reviewed in that way.
Okay, you agree, Mr.
I
West?
agree with that.
Okay, I
definitely.
could tell when you.
Madam Chair, I just have one question.
Yes, Mr. Schultz.
I just want to ask you what your thoughts are.
I don't think his mic is
No?
working.
No, it was working. Okay. What your thoughts are with respect to the local board of canvassers providing for written comments on the objection. Do you envision the nomination papers having redesigned so there's a box next to every name, every line, where the board of canvassers will input an abbreviation like voter not found or signature not found or whatever? Or do you envision on the written objection that there be a separate piece of paper with reference to the line where the endorser signed as to the nature of the objection by the board of canvassers?
I
Just want to
think-
find out exactly what you envision how this is going to work.
I think your first example more closely reflects what we envision, where it would have a box to the right and a proper code put there, whether it would be an alpha code or a numerical code, perhaps with a key at the bottom, which indicates what those codes mean. We also do have the option of generating a report from the central voter registration system based on what they enter into the system. However, the issue with that is that if a voter is not found, meaning they're not a registered voter in the state, they don't actually appear on that report. So if you're not registered, you're not in the central voter registration system. So we think that the actual writing of the information on the actual nomination paper, and that copies can be given to that candidate, will inform them in writing of what the decision was on each and every signature. And I will also note, before I forget, that the ACLU has submitted testimony in writing, which you should have in your packet, in support of this legislation.
Any other questions?
No.
Okay. Continue.
Next is the proposed legislation pertaining to write-ins. This proposal remains similar to previous years. This is our fourth submission of this legislation, requiring a candidate to file a declaration of intent. As presented before, many states, over half the states in the country, do require some sort of submission, a declaration of intent for a person who wants to cast a write-in. Those requirements can vary from 7 days before, 3 days before, or even some states like Texas, which require a whole month before. This proposal would require that the Friday before the election, that a notice of intent be filed with the same office at which that candidate would have had to file a declaration of candidacy. So that is new from previous iterations of this legislation, which did pass the House on at least one occasion in the past, in previous iterations. Another change to this proposal would require, to make it clearer that the write-in candidate would need to meet all the same residency requirements as of a candidate who filed their declaration of candidacy in June. So that language was added in there just to clarify that, so that it would not be vague. Otherwise, the remainder of the legislation does remain the same. Local boards and the Board of Elections on mail ballots would only be required to tally write-ins for candidates who file that declaration of intent. And the write-ins would still need to be tallied in contests where no candidate is on the ballot for that particular contest. The entire set of scanned images of the write-ins, because the DS200 tabulators at the polls and at the early voting sites and our high-speed tabulators actually capture a picture of every single write-in on every single ballot. And we would provide those images on our website for the public to review. We just would not be required to tally them. But even if we're not tallying them, the public would be able to see and view those write-in images.
Question? Mr. DeSimone?
And the record of those other non-tallied votes, that they would be maintained for however long we maintain our regular records, correct?
Yes, and
They
currently,
wouldn't, the electronic image wouldn't be lost after a period of time.
it would not be, no. And we currently maintain things indefinitely, honestly. We have things going back to the 80s and 90s.
And that would avoid the local boards having to have someone sit there and count out 10 votes for Mickey Mouse, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. Okay. And the,
Which used to be part of my duties as the chairman of the local board.
yes, we do get many complaints about this requirement. In the meantime, we have tried to make the process as efficient as we can. But in fact, we are still not completed with tallying the write-ins from the 2022 election at this time. So it's definitely something that the local boards support. And I know that the elections committee on the City and Town Clerks Association has been supportive of as well. And that's why we pushed to try to advance this through the legislature for a fourth time.
And you would note that in correspondence from the ACLU, they are not
Yes, I will note that
agreement.
in all the years that this has been proposed, they have not been in agreement with this for because of the reasons that they state here. I will also note that this has changed. Each proposal has changed based on feedback that we have gotten from the legislatures and in the committee hearings. And we have modified it. It has gone from the day before the election requirement to have this notice of intent filed to the 7 days before, and then back to Friday before as a compromise. That was based on input from the chairs of the judiciary committees where elections matters were once held.
Good to know that. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Miguel,
Just, oh, go ahead.
No,
Mr.
please.
Schultz. No,
over the, say, the last 10 election cycles, the write-ins really have been two groups. Those who are voters, and the name appears, and those who are not registered voters, like Mickey Mouse and so forth, okay? For those that are the registered voters, how many write-ins would you say would be the maximum number that you and your staff have been tallied in the election?
I mean, that's hard to say because we only receive a couple of write-in campaigns, actual bona fide write-in campaigns every election season. My hope would, and my assumption would be, if they are running a write-in campaign in future campaigns, they would file this notice of intent if that's their, if they are intending to run as a candidate for public office. It's hard for us to know who on the ballot. We don't check to see registration status when we read a write-in. We see a name. I mean, sometimes it can be just a phrase, many of which I'm not going to repeat here because it wouldn't be repeatable. But there are many names on there. Sometimes it could be a family member. Sometimes it could be an actual person who maybe a former public official who people would prefer to vote for. But we simply tally, and we have to tally everything because the law does state that we have to publish them only if they achieve five votes. But in order to know whether someone achieves the 5 votes, we actually have to count them all and then only publish those that achieve more than 5. In this scenario, we would publish everything. We would just publish the images rather than have a person physically read the name off of a computer screen that the picture is taken of on the ballot. We would actually just publish all the images for the public to see for themselves. So if someone had cast a write-in vote for a family member, for example, they could go in and see that on our website to validate that that was in fact cast for that person.
So how easy is it to depict those images on the BOE website?
It's actually very easy. It's an Excel spreadsheet. So Excel spreadsheet, every row in the Excel spreadsheet has the image.
Right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. West, you had?
my question was just that with these changes now that you have both some assurance that your legislation would pass through the legislature.
Based on the changes we've made with the feedback that we've gotten, now we have added some new language here to cover the residency. So that, that might encounter some questions in the General Assembly, but based on past changes that we've made based on feedback, I would think so.
Okay. And people are going to have to register to get their name as a write-in, correct, prior to the election. Or now this is before the ballots go out, after the ballots go out? What are we talking here?
So I think we wanted to, that was the reason for putting it as close to the election as possible, because we didn't want to make the requirement so that if something were to happen where unfortunately there's only one candidate on the ballot and they were to, pass away or resign, there's no one on the ballot. This would cover that scenario, but we did not want it to have to be far out, so someone could actually have to declare for the office the notice of intent well in advance of the election. They could do it a couple of weeks up to the election. So it would be after the ballots are printed. It would just give someone that flexibility to a week before the election say, I don't agree, with something and want to run if they wanted to. We don't want to restrict anyone from doing that. We just want to tally the write-in votes for actual candidates rather than for these imaginary figures or other reasons that we get. And we also want our campaign finance division to know that there are actual candidates running, because write-in candidates are actually subject to the same reporting requirements as actual candidates. And many times, I mean, I will send Rick Thornton a name of someone, a community that has a write-in campaign. He wouldn't know anything about it. So someone could be out there printing, stickers and printing out campaign materials or running as a write-in. And they haven't filed any campaign finance reports, and he would reach out to that person and make them aware of that. They would
Very
have to
good
do
point.
that.
Very good point.
Yeah, okay,
Anything
thank
else,
you.
Mr. West?
Thank you.
Okay. Next, Miguel?
Our next piece of legislation would allow the drop boxes to be open 30 days prior to Election Day, rather than the current 20 days allowed under state law. This extension was based on discussions with the City and Towns Clerks Association in the local boards. They were receiving some complaints at the local level from voters who were receiving their ballots about a month before the election, which is typically when the Secretary of State has sent them out in previous years, and they were not able to actually cast them into an official drop box because the law required them to be open 20 days before the election. So we did agree with this problem that they were facing, and we agreed with the 30 days. However, based on some discussions we had with the Secretary of State's Elections Division, they propose extending it on an additional 5 days on top of the 30 days in order to avoid the drop box from requiring to be opened on a Sunday, which would make the local boards go on a Sunday to actually open that. So we have no opposition to that recommendation, whether it's 30 or 35. We know that it needs to be longer than the current 20.
Any questions?
Yeah, just on that one, please. Uh, Sometimes the local boards, they've opened them on Sundays for voting registration.
On the deadline, yes, which is 30 days.
Yeah, okay, so the boxes would be available that time. So that would be in that time frame for 30 or 35 days.
Yes, the law gives some flexibility to the local boards to open between 1 and 4 on the Sunday, be on the deadline, or they can designate another location within the city or town to accept registration. So some do either or. This actual drop box for mail ballots would be open 5 days before even that. So it would be open the week prior to that happening.
And I, excuse me, I don't note any opposition in any of the mailings we received to this particular item. Okay.
No.
Next one, Miguel?
Do we, as far as the changing it from the 30 days to 35 days, is there any a recommendation? I mean, we are fine with the 35 days.
Does anyone have anything to say with reference to the 35 versus 30? I don't think that the board is in opposition to that at all.
No, I think the closer you can get it to when the ballot comes out, the better.
Absolutely.
From my standpoint.
Okay, and
So
I'm
we
sure we do have members of the local boards here as well. I mean, if you want to listen to their comments after I'm done or now, whichever you
We'll let
prefer.
you conclude and then we'll go over any
Okay.
questions they may have or comments. Go ahead.
The next piece of legislation is the special primary dates.
Well, are you not doing the mail ballot?
I think he's
Oh,
saving that for
I was going to
last.
leave that for last,
Okay.
yes. We've updated the language in this proposal. You should have the new version in front of you there. It essentially achieves the same intent of the original piece of legislation that you received. The proposal would actually allow for more time before the election for the primary to be held, ensuring that the first Tuesday after the first Monday in the preceding month will be available to hold a special election. As you know, this board supported legislation several years ago to make elections in the state, special elections in the state more uniform, where any special election would have to be held on the first day, the first Tuesday after the first Monday. Well, one unintended side effect of that is that occasionally during the year, there will be too few days between the first Tuesday in one month and the first Tuesday in the next month to meet that requirement for the primary to be held by that deadline. So this just makes it clear that in special elections, the special primary would be held by the first Tuesday after the first Monday in the month before the special general election. And generally, in all my years here, Most special elections, that's how it happens. You would have, for example, the special election in November, but then the special primary would be held in October. So that vacancy can be filled as expeditiously as possible by the local community.
Okay, any questions? Okay, Miguel?
A final piece of legislation to cover is our proposal for mail ballots. In summary, this proposal would eliminate the requirement for signing with an X for voters who cannot sign their name due to physical incapacity. Instead, a box is checked on the application or on the ballot certification envelope, which we receive back, and the person providing the voter with assistance must sign and provide their signature and information. This similar, a requirement similar to this or such additional requirements are actually required in other states when we reviewed them. You should have a summary of the research that my staff did on what the other 49 states do in regards to mail ballots being received from voters who cannot sign. And in fact, we are the only state at this point that that would accept a mark or an X without any additional information from the voter in order for that voter to be tabulated. If the assistance information is not provided, the goal would be to send the voter a cure notice, in which that information can subsequently be provided so that the ballot can be qualified. We did reach out to the Disability Law Center and the Common Cause and the ACLU and the Governor's Commission on Disabilities for their input into this proposal. And they did have some suggestions in terms of the replacing the language or mirroring that language to what is in the statute for receiving assistance at the polls, which requires for unable to mark, inability, blind, or inability to write. We did not see an issue with mirroring the language in the assistance statute, which is under 171926 and 171926.1. That language is not included in this draft, but again, we do not have a problem with mirroring that image in the requirement for the in this proposal. I will note that the ACLU has made that similar request to rather than eliminate the or otherwise language, as you can see in your proposal, it says physical incapacity or otherwise is the reason why someone is marking with an X. That language be further defined similar to what is in the statute for assistance at the polls. This Governor's Commission on Disabilities, Bob Cooper, he did submit testimony that he felt that the otherwise should be left in. But the Governor's Commission on Disabilities and the ACLU did submit testimony that it should be modified to conform, to make the otherwise more defined, such as blindness or such as inability to read and write, which is in federal and state statutes.
I actually thought that that was a very good suggestion. I don't know how the board feels about that, but it seems to me to make it clearer is probably better. And I agree with both disability rights folks and also the ACLU in their suggestion.
So that would be the first major component of that. The second major component would be to allow a 3-day transmittal period after the deadline of the mail ballot deadlines to allow local boards to accept mail ballot applications if delivered via the postal service. This is similar to how voter registration already works in the receipt of voter registration forms. Currently, local boards are forced to reject many mail ballot applications that are delivered to them in the days after the deadline. They must then send the voter a rejection letter, and they usually include an application for an emergency mail ballot, which looks almost identical to the regular mail ballot application, I will note. And this has led to both complaints from the local board for being forced to reject applications for mail ballots, and needing to, it generates paperwork because they need to send this voter a notice, and with another application to complete. And the voters generally will say, well, I already filled out this application. And they point out to them, well, this isn't a regular mail ballot. This is an emergency mail ballot application. So this would allow the local board, if the Postal Service delivers applications to them by the Friday after the deadline, that they would be allowed to process those by that Friday in order to have that voter be approved for a ballot. Now, anything received the week after or after that Friday would still require a letter. But based on our discussions with the Elections Division of the Secretary of State and the local boards, the City and Town Clerks Association, they feel that the vast majority of them would be handled with the 3 days. That would cover the volume, the small volume that they would get in those 3 days. We did have discussions with the Secretary of State's office about the bill, and their suggestion was that perhaps we would choose to split these bills up into 2 bills rather than have them all included in one, meaning that the assistance form portion be placed in one bill, and then the changes regarding the transmittal period be placed into another. And there is one other change in this, which is minor, which no longer requires that the local boards bring their certification sheets to us, because we no longer need those certification sheets or mail ballot applications, because we now match against the central voter registration system. So when a voter sends us their ballot, we no longer need to compare their signature on that ballot envelope to the application. We actually go into the central voter registration system and look at that. So we no longer need the applications. They'd still be required to retain them for the requirement of on the state statute, but we could certainly ask for them if we're doing any sort of investigation or review. But that would only be upon request.
Okay. Any comments, questions?
I have
Mr. Scholes?
I have one question, really one comment concerning the 3 days. Shouldn't it be that it is the mail ballot envelope or the application be postmarked prior to the deadline, but received within the 3 days thereafter? Because otherwise you could have a scenario where it could be postmarked after the deadline's passed and also delivered within 3 days.
We did, in previous drafts, we did have a postmark in there. However, we removed it based on discussion, and as you know, in previous years, we've had a lot of contact with the post office and the discussion of postmarks. And even with the local boards, many items are not postmarked as you would expect them to be. Many things come in, they're not postmarked. And in order to treat them similar to how a voter registration would be treated, for example, which does allow for receipt of registrations by our own regulations and by state law, which do not have the postmark in a certain transmittal period, this would line up with that to most extents, and it would require that it be delivered by the post office. So if someone coming in, it would not be received by the post office. It would have to be received by the Postal Service. But we did consider the postmark, but we felt that many of them would be excluded because the post office did not, in fact, postmark it.
Mr. West?
Madam Chair.
Would they be time stamped when they are received by the local board?
Yes, that is the practice. They timestamp everything that's time sensitive.
So everything on that, by that 3rd day at whatever time they leave, 4 or 5 o'clock, that's it. That's the last thing that gets time stamped, and after that, it's rejected, correct?
Correct. After that Friday, anything that comes in would be rejected, and they would be sent a notice rejecting it.
But didn't they to be put in there to make people feel a little better about that? The fact that you're going to receive them 3 days after, but the fact that they're going to be delivered by the post office and they're time stamped by the office for those 3 days maximum, with some kind of wording be needed to be put in the bill, just for, like I say, clarification, or to ameliorate people's, shall we say, they might have thoughts that we're doing something that's not correct.
We can certainly look at anything that would help the bill further passage. I would certainly be in support of. We can certainly look at adding some language in there to say that must be noted as received. But I do know that is their practice and our practice and at the local boards.
So love the fact that that's fine, but the fact that now you're going to add these 3 days, and I think just something in there that makes the public feel a little comfortable that, okay, they're gonna be 3 days late coming in, but on that third day, that's it, and they're all gonna be time stamped when they were received. So just thinking,
We can add
Could be
some
practice.
language to that effect that makes that clear.
we can do that. All right, thank you.
Miguel, I note that we had something that was sent to us that looks like an affidavit. Is this just like an example of what would be used to provide that voter assistance?
That is
form?
correct,
That's-
yes.
That would be, that's like a model of what we would use.
Well, I will note that the language that we would work with the Secretary of State's office with, I will say they are here, I'm not going to speak for them, but they did not indicate any opposition to this requirement. But it would be printed on the actual application or on the oath envelope that we receive back with the ballot.
Okay. And the other thing I was going to mention was that someone did an incredible amount of work to come up with this survey of the 49 other states to tell us exactly what the practice is. So we appreciate that very much. Looks like a ton of work went into that. So
I
thank
will
you.
give Jen Regan
Thank you.
80% or a lot of the credit, but she was also assisted by Manny and Jacob as well.
It's very thorough. So thank you for that. Any other questions of Miguel at this point?
Madam Chair, just to get back to what my fellow commissioners mentioned with regard to the 3 days. It seems like a long period of time beyond the statutory deadline to go 3 days when we're in a very small state and without a postmark as referenced by one of the commissioners, we're in a situation where you could in theory mail this beyond the deadline and get it within the 3 days. You can clearly, and again, you'd be taking a chance, but you could in fact mail your ballot 2 days after the deadline and get it in a single day in some of the communities, depending on where you mailed it from. So I have a little concern over that 3 days, that 3 day extension. I'm just not sure how much, and maybe you can shed some light on this when we get these things to, when we do convene a subcommittee. I'm just not sure how many ballots does it affect, the boards having to rescind them because they're not presented on time.
Well, that's a great question because we actually had a lot of discussion about the days. And originally, we wanted to mirror what the voter registration allows, which is 5 days. But the voter registration deadline is on a Sunday. So it naturally leads to on the Friday after the extension for that window, that transmittal period. This would be different. A 5 day would require it to be held on a Sunday would be the deadline. And that didn't make much sense to have the deadline fall on a Sunday, which would probably not, meet statutory falling on a Sunday regardless. But then we thought about 6 days to cover anything that is in the postal stream over the weekend in the Providence Central sorting system to get there by the Monday and be able to be processed. But then again, some of the current concerns that you point out were brought up about that being too long. So then after some discussion with the local clerks, we came up with the Friday as being the compromise to allow that because much to our surprise, and Bob can clarify if I'm wrong, but I believe even now the standard has fallen to the level, the 2 day window. If you send something in the state, I mean, there's always for many years, you would send something one day in Rhode Island and it would be received by the recipient the next day. But first class within the state has fallen to a 2 day, 2 to 3 day service period. And we felt that if they put it in the mail by that Tuesday, which is typically when the mail ballot deadline is, and the early voting starts the following day, that it would get to the local board by that Friday if they put it in that last day into the mail. So that was the thinking between the different iterations in the draft.
Okay. Anything else? Okay. Does anyone want to comment on any of the proposals? I know we have folks from the Secretary of State's office here. I don't know if either of you would like to comment on the legislation that's being proposed or anything you'd like to add, or I know, Miguel did raise a lot of your issues. So if there's anything else. Okay. Nick, did you want to say something? Mr. Lima? City of Cranston.
Thank you, members of the board, and also Tracy Nelson, who's the chair of the Elections Committee, is
Okay,
here as well.
very good.
So just to kind of, I think, allay some of the board's thoughts on the 3-day transmittal period. As an election official, my job is always to look out for the interests of the voters. And of all the duties I've had to do over the last 6 years in conducting 8 statewide elections, the number one thing that has distraught me is the rejection of mail ballot applications when received just after the deadline. I have sat in my office to 11 o'clock or midnight on the day following the deadline, rejecting applications for voters who have never missed an election, for voters who are elderly, for voters who have voted by mail in multiple elections, but simply because they put their application into the mail stream 4 or 5 days prior to the deadline, for whatever reason, the Postal Service delivered it to us on Wednesday when the deadline is Tuesday. And to me, it breaks my heart to do that, because then I know at that point, there's only 19 days to the election or 18 days to the election. And I'm now, instead of spending 1 minute to process the application, which is otherwise correct, has all the information we need to send that voter the mail ballot that they're looking for, we then have to spend 10 minutes going into the system to go through the full process to reject it. It's a large administrative burden for us, which is why we're in the office late each night that particular week in the election cycle. But it's particularly concerning to me because I know then by mailing them that emergency mail ballot application and that rejection letter, they need to fill out that emergency app, mail it back to us in many cases because the voters are often homebound. And by the time that all happens, now it's 8 days before the election or 7 days before the election. And now the Secretary of State needs at least a day or two to get the ballot out to them. And basically we're disenfranchising voters. And that's why it kind of tugs at my heart a bit, because it's counter to everything else I normally do as an election official. So how does that all actually affect the law? Well, obviously the lawyers in the room can probably explain this better than I ever could. But anytime we have a law on the books that restricts someone's rights, there has to be a justified reason for it. In the case of the mail ballot deadline, we have, except for military overseas voters, we need to receive a mail ballot by 8 o'clock on election night. There's a reason, there's a justification. We don't want people voting once the results are known. With the mail ballot application deadline, it's a purely administrative process. That 20-day deadline is in statute simply to ensure that the Secretary of State's office has enough time to get the ballot out to the voter so they can vote it and return it prior to election day. The Secretary of State's office has said that whether it's 15 days or 16 days or 20 days, there is still enough time. So it's not an administrative question. So whether it's a 3-day transmittal period or a 5-day transmittal period, the only compelling interest I think that government has in having that deadline at all is simply so that we can follow our administrative processes. It's not like that 20-day mail ballot application deadline there is really there for any other policy reason. So to me, because it's kind of an arbitrary process, it's really in the interest of the voter that as long as it's reasonably clear that their mail ballot application was put in the mail stream by that 20-day deadline, we should be able to process it, whether it's 3 days after. It could even be longer, but I think 3 days is good because there was a question about the volume. I mentioned how, that particular week where they are late, just in Cranston alone, we receive, in some cases, over 100 mail ballot applications on the Wednesday, then another 60 or 70 on the Thursday, and then it trickles down to another 20 or 30 on the Friday. But we're talking about several hundred voters just in my city. Those are voters that we're spending time rejecting, we're mailing out the application to, and in some cases, those voters may be disenfranchised because they don't have time to get that application back. And what kills me is we already have all the information we need sitting right there in our office to send them the mail ballots. We're sending them the exact same identical form. It's a purely administrative process. The only thing really different on the form, it says emergency at the top. So we're complying with the law for the sake of the law. But the entire point of the law is to make sure that we have enough administrative timeline, and we know we have enough administrative timeline. So I just, on that particular one, I mean, the Board of Canvassers in Cranston, myself, we support all of the bills that Miguel has spoken with about today. But that one is really kind of, like I said, tugs at my heartstrings because as an election official, it is something that I just really haven't enjoyed doing the last few years. And I think we can really help voters. When we're talking statewide, probably a couple of thousand unnecessary rejections. There's no compelling reason or interest for us to reject those applications, which are otherwise valid. And at the end of the day, they are just applications for a mail ballot, not the actual ballot itself.
Well, we appreciate your input, and are you sure you're not an attorney? Because that was a really good argument. Thank you, Nick. Thank you. Tracy, did you want to say something?
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. I guess I can't elaborate much on what Nick said. He's got that covered. But I just wanted to add a couple other points. As far as the emergency mail ballot, I've been involved in elections for 20 years. And going from the early voting to emergency, from emergency to early voting, I think the whole premise of the deadline is because we went from a regular mail ballot period to an emergency mail ballot period. And Diane, I'm sure you can recall, back in those days, there were categories that you had to qualify for. And when you applied for an emergency ballot, you had to attest to the fact that those circumstances occurred in the 20 days preceding the election. That is no longer the case. We now have no excuse mail ballots. So it's kind of, we changed the law in one way, but it's still prohibitive in another way. So I think it just makes sense at this point to allow us those few extra days, 3 days, 5 days. I think 3 days is good because I think in most aspects, if someone mails it, the day of the deadline or the day before, and I know it says on the application that it has to be received by your board, but people don't understand what that means. They don't bother to read most of the information on there. So it becomes an overwhelming administrative process. And as an election official, there's nothing worse than telling someone, I can't take this application because you might have mailed it the day before, but we didn't get it until the day after. But here's the exact same application with the word emergency on it. So if you fill this out, we can get you a ballot.
That's right.
So it's just, I think what's happened is when we make certain changes to pieces of legislation, we don't really realize how it kind of affects the other pieces. And I think this is a way to kind of rectify one of those outstanding pieces. Just another point on that with the 3 days, the deadline to receive the mail ballot applications is usually the Tuesday. And then we usually have until, and Kathy or Rob can confirm this, we usually have until the to that Friday at 4:00 by the end of the day to input them, so that they're available to the Secretary of State's office to see them. So that just, the 3 days just would coincide with that deadline. It would give us until Friday to receive them and get them in. And I know I know Nick, if we get one in the mail on Friday, we're going to stay and get those in by the
Absolutely.
deadline on Friday so that these people can get their mail ballots and not have to go through the laborious process. Nick hit on this a little bit. You know, we get this application, we have to reject it. We have to still input the entire application into the system to reject it. It generates a rejection letter. And then we have to copy the application because the letter says, you know, your enclosed application. And then we have to provide them with another form. So it's a lot of unnecessary labor. And with elections becoming so complicated, this would just provide us with a little bit of a reprieve that not only benefits the local boards, but certainly benefits the voters. As far as, you know, I agree in some ways with the idea of the law should say that, you know, it has to be postmarked because we don't want someone mailing it the day after and then, excuse me, and, you know, still getting it within the 3 days. So I understand the premise behind the requirement for a postmark. The only thing I can say to that is, and I don't know, but maybe you could put something in the regulations that says if the postmark date is, you know, on the day of or the day prior and received within 3 days, you know, received as recorded by the local board within the 3 days, something to that effect, and then put something in the regulations that says if no postmark exists and it's received within the 3 days, then it would be accepted. And that's really all I have unless anybody has any questions.
No,
for
that
me.
was very well stated. Anybody have any questions of Tracy? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
John, man.
Mr. Mary.
Mr. Marion, would you like to speak?
Rob, am I on?
No.
There we go. Rob Rock, on my way up here, said I should be brief. So I'm getting heckled. So I on that same piece of proposed legislation, but not on the 3-day question, I just want to, we didn't send a letter like Disability Rights Rhode Island or the ACLU, but I just wanted to share that we do support the idea behind the bill, and thank Bob and Miguel. Met with myself and Kate Bowden yesterday and walked us through not only the proposed changes, but the rationale. And I'm grateful Miguel followed up with the research that he and his team did. You know, we don't necessarily support what would on its face look like sort of a burden on a voter. But it, you know, given that the state is now relying on the signature match for proof of identity, it makes sense that we would, for voters who couldn't provide a signature, require this other information. The last point is, you know, on behalf of my organization, we agree with Disability Rights Rhode Island's conclusion, or I guess maybe not conclusion is the right word, but support for sort of harmonizing the statute with respect to polling place assistance at polling places. We think that language should be the same, just as they stated in their letter. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions of John? Appreciate it. Thank you. So what shall we do?
Well,
Mr.
Madam Chair, I would move approval of the submissions to go to the General Assembly as presented by the Deputy Director, with the understanding that this may be reviewed at the subcommittee level at some point to discuss any potential changes or any requests from the legislature that might come back to us.
Well, that's a good point. Is there a second to, seconded by Mrs. Johnson?
Just so I understand, Madam Chair, so for example, the 30 to 35 days would not be part of your motion?
Oh, and I'm sorry, and to change
Yeah.
that to 35 days in
Because
accordance with the recommendation.
Yeah, there
by,
were three
the Secretary's office.
recommendations. There was that one on 17, 20, 22.1, and then there were the two on 17, 22.1 on the
What would you need to clarify?
language that would use, as Mr. Marion just said, to make sure that everything's uniform with respect to the use of the X signature. Do you want to have that in there as
You
well?
mean to include the term otherwise?
Not otherwise, but the other qualifiers that.
Oh, to
were-
mirror the language with
Yes.
that, that's not part of my motion.
Okay, okay. So it's just the 30 to 35. Okay, got it.
I'm sorry, I wasn't listening.
I'm not moving that. If somebody else wants to add that, that's fine.
So
but
you
I'm not.
added the 35
Correct.
days.
That's correct.
So we'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
There's another question here, but before we do that, is there any other modifications to the motion that anyone would like to make at this point? Okay, before we take a vote on that, though, we have a question from Mr. Scholes, and I just want to make sure this was clarified during your conversation. Miguel?
I came in late, so I apologize about, you made the presentation before I was here. But I'm talking, the proposed legislation for 1931, the irregular ballots,
The write-ins, yes.
all right? I had a question concerning the first sentence, because when I read it, I felt there was, I needed a little clarification,
Okay.
so that's going to address that.
Just have to. find
That is the mail ballot.
Which one is
it?
It's under the mail, it's the mail ballot section.
17, 19, 31.
Yeah, that would be the third page there, or the second page of the declaration of the intent of writing candidacy, second
Yes.
page, yes. What was the question regarding this?
Well, well, I wasn't here when you started your presentation, so I don't know whether or not you addressed that. My question was, the first sentence of that paragraph needs to be clarified. Because as I understand it, we had a situation here where a candidate on the Warwick City Council was running unopposed until he showed up and saw the name of his erstwhile opponent on the ballot, but that opponent did not qualify, he could not submit nomination papers. Is this what this was addressing?
No, this was actually put in several years ago based on feedback that we received in committee in the House. In the event, and we have it, like, for example, in Block Island, we have common circumstances where no one will run for an office like town moderator or one of these town local contests. And then, so the concern was that, well, if we're not required to tally the write-ins, then if no one knew to file a notice of intent, or no one filed one, then the special election would have to be held for that contest in order to fill it. And that addressed that, where if there is no eligible candidate on the for that office, then we would need to tally the write-ins, so a winner would be chosen and no special election would have to be held. I think that the term eligible candidate would cover that, because I don't believe that candidate in Warwick was ultimately eligible. He was erroneously put on the ballot, but he wasn't actually an eligible candidate.
Yeah, we get the issue as well, that the votes for the ineligible candidate would be counted. So if this passed, would the votes for that ineligible candidate be counted?
No, and I think this also ties into the fact that we're not allowed to tally write-ins for a candidate who is on the ballot. So, for example, if there's a candidate for governor, and rather than complete the oval for that candidate, the person writes in that candidate's name in the write-in, where the state law does not allow us to count that write-in, because they already have an oval, they're already an eligible qualified candidate on the ballot, and that ties into that as well.
Didn't know that.
Okay, well, on that first sentence over there, you had, at the first line, the word "or." You had to say, or in any other office. That's what I feel is, it becomes a little ambiguous. When you say, or in any other office.
Is this
What was that referring to?
line 1 or 2 under 171931?
This would be starting at line 1 and going on to line 2.
Okay, so your concern is with "or any other office"?
I'm only talking about the wording of it,
Mhm.
with,
For any office, it
it
says.
says, or in any other office. I don't see how that clarifies the situation. It becomes ambiguous.
Mhm.
At least that's my reading of it.
So, so you're saying that you don't believe that the terminology or that phrase there needs to be in there?
I think there should be another sentence, okay? To take that thought, to put that in another sentence, so there'll be no question what it means.
So perhaps the subcommittee could look at that for clarity and make a recommendation? That's right. The subcommittee will see it after submission. So this says, for any office in which no eligible candidate appears, not any other office, it's any office,
And it says, or in any office, it says next.
or in any other, I see what you mean, okay. How would you clarify it though, Mr. Scholes? Or maybe you have a suggestion, Ray, on how to clarify
My
this.
suggestion would be another sentence to talk about that particular phrase.
I think following what Mr. DeSimone said, which is not try to correct it on the fly, but to make the change with the subcommittee would make sense.
Okay,
That's
that
my
okay with you?
thought about that.
okay, so that's part of our minutes and certainly part of the charge of the subcommittee. So at this point, we have a motion and we have a second to that motion to approve this legislation as submitted by Miguel. The only difference is that we made it 30, we changed it from 30 to 35 days. Is that correct? Are there any other?
I would also add, if you want to provide us direction or leave it up to Bob, in terms of the submission of the changes regarding the assistant and the transmittal period, if it should be one bill package or if it should go, as I mentioned earlier, the Secretary of State had suggested we perhaps split them into two separate bills. So the decision has to be made whether or not to leave them in one bill together or go separately.
I think for clarity, it would be better to separate the bills. I
Then
don't know how you feel about that.
I'd certainly add that to the motion to allow the staff or Mr. Reposer or the deputy to split those bills as they see fit.
I think that's a good suggestion. So that would be part of the motion as well, part of the second as well. So we have a motion at this point and a second to approve this with the change from 30 to 35 days on the mail drop boxes and the assistant, changing the,
Format, I guess.
the format is a good,
Yes, that's-
to two bills rather than one
Right. And
pertaining to that,
we'd leave that at the
item number.
discretion of the director and the deputy director.
to their discretion. I like it. Okay? Any discussion? Hope not. Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, it's unanimous vote. Thank you, Miguel.
You're welcome. Do you want me to stay up here, Bob?
A lot
for
of
the
good
next?
work. Yeah, we may need you again, sir. Yeah, good. Okay, moving right along. Item number 4. The board may discuss and vote to support the legislation to be presented to the General Assembly by Common Cause of Rhode Island as set forth in the attached legislative summary. Mr. John Marion, would you come forward, please?
Thank you again. And I just want to thank you for putting this on the agenda. It's wonderful for you to give this your consideration. So as you stated, I'm here to ask for your support on a piece of legislation. It's a draft constitutional amendment that would make Rhode Island the 23rd state to have same-day voter registration for all elections. Rhode Island has done a lot, as you know, in recent years to increase access both to voter registration and access to the ballot. Online voter registration, automatic voter registration, early voting, and the changes in the Letter I Vote Act last year. But despite all of those changes, we still have this one huge structural barrier that remains, which is our state's 30-day voter registration deadline. As you may know, that's the longest deadline of any state in the United States. In fact, it's the longest essentially that the U.S. Supreme Court will allow. We're one of only 4 states that has our voter registration deadline in our state constitution. In all the other remaining 46 states, they're set by statute. It was put into our constitution back in 1974 at a time when voter registration was a completely paper process. So now, as you know, we've had the central voter registration system for decades, and for the last 6 or 7 years, we've had electronic poll books. So we don't live in a paper deadline era anymore. We live in an electronic era. Looking no further than last November's election, we see how much this is needed. So I asked the Secretary of State's office for information about provisional voters in last November's election, and there were 1,025 provisional ballots cast from people who showed up at their polling place on election day, but were forced to cast a provisional ballot because they had registration problems. This does not include people who didn't bother to show up at their polling place because they knew they had registration problems, or people who showed up at their polling place and were directed, to their correct polling place, maybe at their prior address. So it probably is far more than 1,000 people who would have been enfranchised if we had same-day voter registration last November and would have been allowed to vote or vote a poll ballot. So as I mentioned, this is the law in 22 states in the District of Columbia. The estimates by the academics are that those states have increased turnout of between 3 and 12%, which is staggering. We know that 8 of the top 10 states in the United States in voter turnout are same-day voter registration states. So there's my argument. What the actual language in front of you does is 5 things. First, it removes the constitutional 30-day deadline to register to vote. As I stated, we're just one of a handful, 4 states in total that have that in the state constitution. The second, and I think the most significant, is it enshrines in the Constitution a right to same-day voter registration. If we're successful, this is going to have to go on the ballot. We're going to have to convince, 51% of voters in Rhode Island to support it. We think the way to do that is to tell them we're trying to give you the right to do something. We're not just deleting language in our Constitution. We're actually enshrining a new right into our Constitution. It doesn't specify how that would have to work. And we want to work with the clerks. We want to work with the secretary. We want to work with the board on thinking about how the enabling statute that would be necessary should this pass would work. We don't want to impose a burden on election administrators that they're not able to carry out. So we think there is a chance to work together there. The third thing it does is it removes the constitutional 30-day state and local durational residency requirements and leaves it to the General Assembly to impose a durational residency requirement. As the memo I sent you shows, about 50% of the states with same-day voter registration don't have durational residency requirements. About 50% do have durational residency requirements. In some instances, the state residency requirement is different than the local residency requirement. In some cases, they're the same. In most instances, they're not as long as 30 days. The shorter the durational residency requirement, the more people you're enfranchising, right? The person who 15 days before the election moves from Cranston to Providence wants to vote in Providence. If the durational residency requirement is shorter than 30 days and we have same-day voter registration, they're going to be able to vote a full ballot. The fourth thing is it removes the same-day registration language that is already in our state constitution. As you know, in presidential elections, voters, in some instances, many thousands of voters take advantage of this, can vote just a presidential, vice presidential only ballot in presidential years. That would be unnecessary if we had a full system of same-day voter registration. And I just think the existence of that for generations shows that we can do this, right? We do it in presidential elections. I think we can do it in all other elections. And then the final one is a change to Section 2 of the article in the Constitution, which essentially just keeps in place the 30-day durational residency requirement for running for office. So right now, one of the qualifications to run for office in our Constitution is that you be a qualified elector. Right now, to be a qualified elector, you have to, be a resident and a registered voter for 30 days, or register to vote 30 days in advance of filing your declaration. So this just maintains the status quo in that respect. We just want to kind of take that issue, which is completely unrelated, like who gets to run for office is completely unrelated to what we're trying to do here. We just want to take it off the table. I know your legal counsel shared with me that he has some questions about that section and maybe some suggestions, and we're very, very open to suggestions on how to make that section correct. That is fairly new, what we're trying to do there. So I'm all ears when it comes to suggestions, particularly on that section. We do hope to get this introduced very soon. As you know, the deadline for bill introductions is soon. I asked the sponsors to hold back because I knew I was going to come here today. So we would love your suggestions. Ultimately, we would love your support. I suspect it's going to go to a subcommittee. I respect that process and I'm happy to work with the subcommittee. But we just ask you to remain open to the possibility that you would support this, because really the way I want to do this is we don't want to impose anything on the locals, on the secretary or the board, right? We want to work with those three, legs of the stool, so to speak, of election administration in the state to make sure this is workable, because if it doesn't work, voters won't get to take advantage of it. So I will end there and happy to answer questions.
Anyone have any questions of Mr. Marion?
I have a couple of questions.
Mr. Schultz?
Yes.
John, this is not the first year that you're going to introduce this, right?
This is not the first year, but this is the first year in this form. The prior 2 years, this is all we did was really eliminate the voter registration deadline and left in place the durational residency requirements and left it to the General Assembly to create a voter registration deadline. This is the first year we're proposing to put same-day voter registration into the Constitution.
But all the prior proposals was to amend the Constitution?
Yes.
The same way you're doing here? What has been the results that you obtained so far?
Well, so, I mean, the legislature's held hearings, but obviously they haven't voted on it to put it on the ballot. But we've always seen this as a long-term goal. So for instance, we were part of the campaign for Let Our I Vote. That campaign had two goals. The first was the Let Our I Vote Act. The second was this. We prioritized the Let Our I Vote Act because we thought it was time, it was necessary to put a lot of those things in place before the 2022 election. And so now that that is done and with the board's help, this is the priority. This has kind of risen to the top.
And what has been the sort of the resistance or the reaction from the General Assembly with respect to the proposal?
Yeah, I mean, we get a lot of questions. I think there were some public statements by the leadership of the Assembly with some questions and concerns. Honestly, that's why that change at the end is in there, right? There were some questions about, could somebody move into the state and run for office right away, register at the same time? That's not the intention here, so we want to take that off the table. I would say in talking to rank and file legislators, they're very, very interested in this, particularly younger legislators, and the legislature has gotten quite a bit younger in recent years because they recognize the voter registration system penalizes more mobile, younger people, right? Younger people are less likely to own homes. They're more likely to rent. Renters are more likely to move, and movers are more likely to have problems with voter registration. I would say, in my conversations, and that's just all they are, there's a lot of energy about people who think this is needed.
Right. Well, you must have given some thought about how the thing's going to work. But how do you envision the registration be? Would people register at the Registry of Motor Vehicles? Would they have to go to the Board of Canvassers to register? But they certainly can't register at the precinct level, because there's no way to handle that. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we don't, yeah, as I said, we don't want to impose our vision of how this should be done on election administrators. I can say there are states that do it at polling places. I believe Wisconsin does it at the polling place. There are 3 states that have been doing this since the 1970s, so they've gotten quite good at it. From what I can tell, most do it sort of the way we do presidential only same-day registration right now, which is they have a central location in each community, and that is where you register and vote in one action. But some do it at the polling place, you know, from what I've discovered.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you, John. Yes, go ahead, Miguel.
John, do you know how many other states that have same-day voter registration have it enshrined in their constitution versus in the statute, only in the statute?
I do not have an exact number. I know that it's a number greater than 0 because a lot of this has been done recently in states which have ballot initiative, right? So people collect signatures and put a constitutional amendment on the ballot statewide. And that's how a lot of these reforms have been passing, because there's quite a few states that have done this. There were a whole bunch of states in the 3 states in the 70s, a bunch of states in the 90s after the NBRA passed. And then there was a recent group of states in the last 10 years. A lot of that's been done by ballot initiative. But I can get an answer to that.
Okay.
Did it?
Yes.
Okay. Does the board wish to take an action relative to this request?
I mean, I would move to refer this to the subcommittee and have the
For their
subcommittee make
consideration?
a consideration and a recommendation at some point.
Motion to refer to the subcommittee for consideration. Do we have a second to the motion?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Scholes. Any discussion?
I guess my only comment would be, what is it, the 16th is the, John, you mentioned you asked the sponsors to hold it back, so
Yeah,
I was just thinking scheduling
But-
for,
But we wouldn't be holding that back, right?
Yeah.
Because we don't submit it.
No,
but any
If-
changes,
if Ray happens to have any suggestions about how to improve that last section,
Got
you
it.
know, I would understand he's not speaking on behalf of the board,
got it.
but if he just has suggestions, I'd be open to that, just so that
Yep.
what goes in reflects, you know, Ray's probably the top election lawyer in the state. It'd be nice to have his input in this. There aren't a lot of folks who can have that eye to do that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was confused.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Mr. West?
Once this gets sent in to the legislature, and that eventually it'll come out of committee maybe, so we could still have input at that point, but once it gets submitted, we could write a letter, or would it be better after it comes out of committee? Should it come out of committee?
Yeah, I mean, my ask would be that if the subcommittee meets and makes a recommendation to support, and the board supports, that, you know, you have the staff, when this gets a hearings in the House and the Senate, that the staff testify, you know, both in writing and verbally, you know, explaining your support. If you had suggestions at that point, you know, we all submit testimony where we say we support it, but we'd like to see these changes. You know, I think that's appropriate as well.
Understood.
We submitted a letter last time, and I think Bob also.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. We will vote. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? It's unanimous vote. Thank you, John.
Yeah, no, thank you for listening and for considering.
Next item on the agenda, the board may discuss and vote to support the legislation to be presented to the General Assembly by the local boards of canvassers as set forth in the attached legislative summary. I don't know if Tracy would like to speak to this at all. I know that.
If possible, because some of it is more Nick's push and
Okay, so
one bill in
why don't you
particular is-
both come forward then if we have any questions? You would like to outline what you have here?
You might want to turn your microphone on too.
There we go.
I apologize, I forgot my packet, so I'm gonna have to cheat.
I have a feeling you know it by heart. but
So
it's okay.
the first bill in your packet is the one that I have been pushing for, and that is to close the schools for presidential preference primaries. As you're aware, the current law is, provides for the closing of schools so that they may be used for polling locations for statewide primaries and general elections. However, the statute does not include presidential preference primaries. In today's world where many of our polling locations, many of our best polling locations are schools because of accessibility, parking, those type of things. And then the safety concerns with having the schools open. And I know personally in Newport, I'm kind of in the mindset now that I just want to open all my polls for every election. So it it causes less confusion. It's just, it's easier. But I am very, very hesitant to use the schools, especially particular schools, especially in Newport when they're in session, especially elementary schools. So this would just add one day every 4 years to the calendar that the schools would be closed. The resistance in the past has come from the Superintendent's Association, but they have supported this time. My representative Lauren Carson and my Senator Dawn Oyer sponsored this bill and got many co-sponsors on this. And we seem to have widespread support of it. The Clerks Association unanimously supported it. So I'm just looking for the board to support it as well.
Okay,
Basically for a safety aspect for the kids.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'll let you take this one.
So assuming your packet's the same order as mine, the next one is regarding the voter registration deadline. Last year, we had a bill put in to eliminate a newspaper ad for the final canvass meeting for a variety of reasons. And that bill actually passed the General Assembly and was signed into law, which was much welcomed by local boards of canvassers. So it's part of basically an incremental effort to chip away at some of these statutes that don't really serve much of a purpose. We'd like to, instead of eliminating, give local boards the option to either post notice for 10 consecutive days on the municipal website, which I think many should probably just do anyway, or to post in the newspaper in general circulation. Now, I think that this has a good chance of passing the General Assembly this year. For one, it's not really a big hit on the newspaper's bottom line. This is just something that's every couple of years. It's a couple of ads. It's not like a zoning ordinance or anything. But more importantly, I've now run 8 statewide elections in the city of Cranston. And in that time, I can count on one hand the number of people who came in on the voter registration deadline day. And I know for a fact that none of those people came in because they saw the newspaper ad that we published twice. I know that because they told me. One of them said they came in because they saw my tweet and they proceeded to file voter registration with us. And it turns out they were already registered to vote anyway. So us being open on that Sunday, that 30-day voter registration deadline, obviously remains fully intact. It just would very simply just allow us to save a little bit of money in terms of our advertising costs for that process, and instead just advertise it on the municipal website, which is, I think, by and large, where people now turn to information. If they don't, they call us. They're not generally looking in the newspaper for a voter registration deadline. If this were to pass, just in the city of Cranston alone, it would save us close to $2,000 in 2024. That's a good chunk of my early voting operational costs for an election. So I'd much rather use that $2,000 to hire poll workers, to get some more signage because I love my election signs, than running what I think is, at this point, an unnecessary ad. If
Okay,
there's any
thank
questions
you.
about that one.
Any questions on that?
I just may point out, Madam Chair, that the newspaper circulation of the Providence Journal is down to about 43,000. And in today's paper, it was about 8 pages long. So I don't think publishing it in the newspaper means anything in today's world.
I've got about 600 Twitter followers, and sometimes when I do tweet these deadlines out from my personal account, I get a few retweets from the Secretary of State's office or the BOE. And once that happens, I've actually almost matched the Projo's circulation.
There you go.
And I love the Projo. The next one, well, the next two bills actually both relate to Rhode Island General Law 17-11-1, which is the voter precinct cap. You may recall that last year, the local boards of canvassers requested legislation to amend the current cap of not substantially more than 3,000 registered voters to, initially, the request was to 4,000, and then with a compromise with members of the General Assembly and voter interest groups, it was amended to 3,500 registered voters. That bill actually passed the full House in 2022. However, it did not advance in the Senate. So what we've done this time is request the sponsors, which is Senator Lombardi on the Senate side. He's the vice chair of the Judiciary Committee, and Representative Baginski on the House side, to introduce that sub-A language that passed the House in both chambers this time. The rationale for this has not changed.
Excuse me 1 second. Is that the version that you presented to us?
Correct. Yeah, and there's a second bill that also touches on this too that I'll address too. So the sub-A version is what, has been introduced in the Senate and is about to be introduced this week in the House. And the justification of this is the same as it was in 2022. The current cap of not substantially more than 3,000 registered voters was established in 2012, and in the intervening years, elections have changed dramatically. In 2020, we know we had more than half of voters vote prior to Election Day, so most polls were very quiet in 2020. That was a unique election, but now we have more data from 2022 to further support that not half, but a good chunk of the electorate, a third of voters or more, are likely to not vote on Election Day itself. So to keep the numbers simple, say you have a 50% turnout in a full right at the cap precinct with 3,000 registered voters assigned to it. That means that 50% turnout election, usually a midterm election, you'd have 1,500 voters casting a ballot. We know that of those 1,500, roughly a third, 500 or so, will not be showing up at the poll. They'll be either submitting a mail ballot or voting early. So now you've got 1,000 voters out of a potential 3,000 actually using the polling place during the 13-hour time frame that it's open. So that poll is by no means stressed by that. So increasing the cap to 3,500, you'd have to apply the same formula. You're not adding 500 voters to the poll. You're adding that fraction of voters that will actually vote. So 50% turnout would be 250 voters. And then only 2/3 of that number are actually going to be showing up at the poll. You're adding 100 to 125 voters to a poll that already is well equipped and can handle 1,000 plus. If you go back a few years before we had early voting, that same poll was handling 1,400 to 1,500 voters. So it's not doing anything out of the ordinary. And part of the hang up, I think, last year with this bill is that that math wasn't fully understood. Simply increasing the cap does not mean we're adding that volume of voters at a polling place. It's an incremental increase. And the key part about this too is that it only affects a handful of precincts in the entire state. In the city of Cranston, we actually have several precincts that are near the cap right now. They're in danger of exceeding the cap. If this bill passes, all that means is that they won't exceed the cap. There's nothing we'd actually can or would do to split those polls up or change them or combine them with anything else because they're already close to the cap as it is. But we're comfortable with the number of voters that they can handle. The danger is if this law does not pass, we get a lot of registrations in a presidential year in particular. In 2024, we may need to add additional polling locations and split up existing polling locations, which mean, and I've got 26 polls in the city. There are 26 best polls. There's a reason I'm not using I'm not using any other polls. So any poll I add is going to be inferior to the locations I already use. And if the cap does not increase and some of those borderline polls that we have exceed the number, we will be required by law to split those polls in two, and I'm going to be required to send a portion of those voters, 500, 1,000 of them, off to a less ideal location when I know that the location that they're at is not at capacity, can handle them easily, with regardless of what the cap number is. So that's the argument that we're making to the state legislature. I hope the Board of Elections is supportive as well. It's good for the Board of Elections because it obviously makes sure that we don't open up precincts unnecessarily, which ties up additional poll workers, additional equipment, DS200s, privacy booths, et cetera. And this is an important priority for the Clerks Association, which voted unanimously a couple weeks ago to support it yet again. And in 2022, this bill was actually also supported by Common Cause and a number of other good government groups. In addition to this cap bill, there's a related bill that simply removes inactive voters from the cap calculation. So that's the last bill for us. I think you have in your packet. And that bill just adds the word active to 1711-1. Now, these two bills could pass concurrently. They could pass separately. One could pass and the other could fail. Either way, it would grant us some degree of relief. The active voter bill may get us an extra 50 to 150 voters for most precincts. There are a ton of inactive voters assigned to an individual precinct. The rationale for that is we already have an existing statute that allocates voting equipment to the polling places based on active voters. It already specifically excludes inactive voters. So we feel that the same should be the case for the calculation for determining polling places. We have some very good evidence to support this change. In 2022, 98.4% of inactive voters did not vote. So including those inactive voters in the cap calculations just really doesn't make sense because they're not voters that we would normally expect to show up at the poll on election day. And it's just basically an oversight, I think, in state law that it's not already there.
Nick, excuse me, what constitutes an inactive voter for those who might not know?
So an inactive voter is a voter who we have sent mail to via the U.S. Postal Service. Has been returned to us as undeliverable. And that process starts a clock where if they don't vote for 2 federal elections, it makes them inactive. And after 2 federal elections, they can be canceled. So by and large, inactive voters are voters who have moved out of state or voters for whatever reason or other have not received mail. And that's why 98% plus do not vote. The 1% or so that do might be a voter who had recently moved, went to a different polling place or the correct polling place. And there's different fail-safe provisions in existing law for that. And that's why you have a small number do vote. But for the most part, inactive voters, we know, aren't actual voters. They're voters who are in the process of being removed from the voter rolls.
Thank you. Any questions, Mr. Weaver?
Just one. When you say you'd have to, if you didn't get relief, you'd have to open another polling place or move voters to another polling place, you'd in effect be taking voters out of what we have called their normal voting place, if you will, right? And you'd
Exactly.
probably receive a number of complaints for that. I would
Exactly.
imagine.
That's my big fear. That's actually why I fought hard for this bill last year and why the Clerks Association is fighting for it again this year. Because like I said, in Cranston, I've got 4 or 5 polls that are right on that borderline right now. And people like those polls. They're in good places. They're big school gyms. They're all our biggest polls.
Yeah.
We don't want to split them because that would mean I need to find somewhere else for a portion of those voters to go. And that will be a less ideal place than they're already at.
Do you find that sometimes they don't vote when they have a change of voting place?
It's often one of our number one complaints, when we have to change a polling place because it becomes unavailable to us or for other administrative reasons, we do get a number of calls, sometimes letters about that. We try to avoid it wherever possible. I think in a good rule of thumb in elections administration is consistency. When people have a polling place that they're used to, it's in their neighborhood. We try to keep that location in place for that population as long as it's possible, really.
As I understand.
If I could
Any other
just add
questions?
to that point, oh, I'm
Yes,
sorry.
no, go
Um,
ahead.
If I could just add to that point, what happens is these people, they go to the wrong polling location and then they don't want to go to their correct polling location, so they end up casting provisional ballots. So that delays results, it adds extra work for us, it adds extra work for you. So that's just another caveat why it makes sense to do this.
Go ahead, Mr. Schultz.
Nick, I guess you discussed this with your association. By increasing the number to 3,500, would this reduce the number of polling places in in cities and towns?
Not by any dramatic means. There's probably a handful of polls that could be combined, but in order to do so, the Board of Canvassers would have to go through the expense and process of re-precincting, not redistricting, but redrawing precinct lines, which means adjusting street lists. They'd have to hire vendors. I don't foresee most towns would undergo that process prior to the next redistricting cycle in 2032. I know in Cranston, we have an in-house GIS person. Because this bill did not pass last year, when we did go through redistricting, we had 26 polls at the end of the day. We could have had 25 polls, but I had one poll that was so borderline, it was only within a few dozen of the existing cap, that I split it right then and there. I took about 400 voters and created what essentially is a pocket precinct. I'd love to take that pocket precinct and recombine it back to where it should be at Glen Hill School in central Cranston, because those voters would find Glen Hill School, I think, much more convenient. So in Cranston, if this bill passed, the only change would be, for one, I wouldn't have to split any existing polls and go from 26 to 30 precincts. But more importantly, I could probably go from 26 to 25, and that's about all I could do. And we're the second largest city. So if you replicate that statewide, it's a very minimal impact. Like I said, I could probably count on one hand the number of polls that could close or be combined. But even then, because there's an expense involved in doing so, that might outweigh the cost of just opening them. I think a lot of boards would hold off on even approaching that until 2032.
And as an election official, you would want to make sure every polling place has probably substantially the same number of voters.
We try to do that to the best we can. Obviously, some polls have bigger interior spaces, bigger parking lots. They're better equipped to handle higher volumes of voters than others. So we do have some, I'd call them neighborhood polls, particularly in the more urbanized areas of the city, that are only handle 800 to 1,200 voters, and we want to keep those polls in effect. And they have to be in effect anyway, because most of them are caused by overlapping precinct and district lines where you can't really combine them, even if you wanted to. But for us, it's when we have those bigger polls that we know can successfully handle a large volume, in some cases several times what they're currently handling. It just, to me, it would be silly in a way to split them up.
Thank you.
Did you have something you want to say, Tracy?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Just to kind of reiterate Nick's comment, the goal of this bill is not to reduce polling locations, it's to avoid having to split them and, having to have more polling locations. Some of our polling locations could probably handle much more than even the 3,500, but at least you can keep all your resources in a centralized location. When you start breaking off extra polls, now you have to dedicate more resources to it. So instead of having just an extra machine, an extra set of poll workers, now you need a whole entire new staff, a whole new set of backup. And then the other thing is many of these polls where we could, accommodate a higher number, and of course it would be subject to the board too, to review these. They've been used as combination polling locations in the past. So they've handled much more than the 3,000 or 3,500 cap for special elections and things like that, where you anticipate a much lower turnout. So it's not, I think, unfortunately, sometimes as Nick said, they see this as we want to add 500 voters to a polling location. That's not what we're looking to do. We're trying to avoid adding additional polling places and creating small pockets and allowing us to just utilize the larger, more accessible, more open locations that we have now without having to worry about, I have one in Newport that is getting close to 3,000. So, if these two bills pass, then it would be unlikely that I would have to do a re-precincting prior to the next census. Whereas if we don't pass at least one of these bills, but preferably both, I don't think we'd be able to hold out till the next census before we can split that one. And it's unfortunate because it's our best polling location in our city.
Understood. Any other questions?
And just presumably the numbers that you discussed with regard to the 1/3 early and mail voting, presumably those numbers will go up as people get used to early voting. I mean,
Yeah,
at least
I think
at
that's
least that's been the thought here from our end.
I think so.
Over time, I think that's the general consensus, is that early voting will continue to increase. Maybe mail voting will stabilize or level out, but as it continues to catch on and people find out how convenient it is, it's a given.
Anything else?
I'd just like to add two
Yes.
things to that.
Oh, go ahead, Miguel.
Just quickly, just so the board's aware, the board was actually responsible for the law being changed, for introducing the law back in, I think, 2008, for the statewide primary schools to be closed, because we used to conduct elections with the statewide primary with schools open. So it was definitely not something that was appealing to have school children and voters crisscrossing in the hallways and the parking lots. And so that was introduced and successfully passed by the General Assembly to have them closed for the statewide primary for all the same reasons that they outlined here for the
Right.
PPP. And secondly, in past elections, we were handling larger numbers of voters more inefficiently in the past because you didn't have electronic poll books. You only had one voting machine. Now we have electronic poll books. Someone scans their license, signs a screen, and it literally takes seconds to process that voter. Whereas in the past, we were processing more voters at the polls, looking them up on a paper list, having them sign an application, having it
Sure.
witnessed, and it would take significantly longer time. So based on the work that we've done with URI, with increasing the number of machines at the polls and with the electronic poll books, and the increasing of the staffing at the polls, the polls operate much differently than they did under the 3,000 limit, when it was even more voters showing up than there are today.
Would you say, Miguel, that the staff is in agreement with all of these legislative proposals, essentially?
Yes, and as Tracy mentioned, they still would need to be approved by the staff and by the board per election. So that's something that would have
That's
to
true.
happen regardless.
That's true. Did you have something, Mr.
I was
Schultz?
just going to say, it's common sense legislation. After all, we're in the digital age.
Right.
We don't need to operate in the horse and buggy age. So, with that, I mean, if the motion is in order, I'd like to
Yes.
move that we support this legislation.
And I would second that.
Moved by Mr. Schultz, seconded by Mr. D. Simone, to support the legislation as proposed by the local boards of canvassers. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, it's unanimous. Thank you very much. Thank you,
Thank you.
both of you. And Miguel, thank you for your stewarding all of this. We appreciate it. No further business. Do we have a motion to adjourn this meeting? Moved by Mrs. Johnson, seconded by Mr. West. This meeting is adjourned at 3:52 PM. All in favor?
Aye.
No opposition.
Yeah. But count this still on.
We did indeed.